Historians of Reddit, what is the biggest "fuck you" moment in history? Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them. One of them with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send a very fast working one to Moscow, and I certainly won't have to send another. Tito to Joseph Stalin. The Battle of Alesia. Julius Caesar's attacking some Gauls in modern-day France. And they go hide in a castle on top of a hill. Caesar's army isn't big enough to take them all at once. And the Gauls have reinforcements coming, so a siege is impossible. So Caesar just builds a bigger castle around the one he's attacking. He literally just built 2 walls back to back in a ring around the castle. The first Gaul army was already too small to defeat Caesar. And his fortifications only gave him a greater advantage. The reinforcements were also unable to defeat Caesar's army now that he was behind several layers of spike pits and both earthen and wooden walls. Plus the Gauls inside had no way to communicate with the reinforcements outside. So they couldn't coordinate attacks. Both Gallic armies were defeated as they attacked Caesar's newly built fortifications. And Caesar emerged victorious. It's probably my favorite battle of all time. The construction and use of the Warwolf. Supposedly the largest trebuchet ever built. When it was disassembled, it would fill up 30 wagons. So anyways, King Edward I built this to siege a Scottish castle. But before it was even built, the Scottish people tried to surrender. To which Edward responded with a prompt no. In actuality he responded with, "You do not deserve any grace, but must surrender to my will." In other words, I built this trebuchet over 40 days and I am most definitely going to use it, and proceeded to use the trebuchet anyways. The second defenestration of Prague. The Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia sends representatives to the Protestant city of Prague telling them to convert to Catholicism. The representatives get thrown out a window and allegedly landed in a pile of manure. So when France exiles Napoleon Bonaparte the first time, they didn't think to change out military personnel. So he basically rolls up to the first French outpost he gets to, says, "Sup," and begins reassembling an army. By the time he gets to Paris, he's got enough forces that France is like, well, welcome back. Ferruccio Lamborghini was a rich man owning his company that built tractors. He talked to Ferrari about the imperfections of his car and how to improve them, and they basically laughed at a young tractor mechanic trying to tell them about sport cars. So he decided to start making luxury sport cars to compete with Ferrari, and thus the rivalry was born. So I'd say the middle finger of this guy to Ferrari was pretty noticeable. Olga of Kiev. When her husband died, the country that killed him assumed they'd just take over and force her into marriage. She straight up killed the dignitaries that were sent to tell her she had to marry, multiple times. In the most intense way possible. She then traveled to where her husband had been killed and basically burnt the place to the ground, again. In the most hardcore, amazing way. They made her a freaking saint. Worth the read on Wikipedia. This is already one of my favorite threads in Reddit history. Galvarino. Chilean warrior who had both his hands cut off by the conquistadors for raising arms against the Spanish. Instead of letting himself serve as a message of helplessness in the face of the invaders, the crazy bastard strapped swords to his stumps and went on the warpath. A pirate known as Jean Lafitte had a bounty of $500 put on him by a governor. So he put a $5,000 bounty on the governor. This is more petty. But when Taft bragged to his friends via telegram about scaling a mountain on horseback, that it was a few thousand feet. Clear weather. All in all not too difficult. His friend replied, "How is horse? More weight." In the 1970s, the small town of Vulcan, West Virginia asked for state funding to replace a bridge into town. The state legislature refused to grant Vulcan the funding they needed. Instead, the town appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. After hearing about the request, the state legislature immediately granted over $1 million for the town to build a new bridge. If a small town in WV asking for Soviet funding in the middle of the Cold War isn't a big middle finger to the state government, then I don't know what is. Napoleon invited his brother-in-law to speak with him before his coronation as emperor to remind the brother-in-law that he objected to Napoleon marrying Josephine because Napoleon would amount to nothing. My personal favorite. The beginning of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. In England, 1066. England's been invaded by a Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and Tostig Godwinson, exiled English earl and estranged brother to the English king. They've already fought one battle. They've captured York. Things are looking good for them. They're chilling, enjoying their success, waiting at Stamford Bridge for the hostages they demanded. It's a hot day. They're not expecting any trouble. But wait, an English army shows up. That's practically impossible. The Battle of Fulford Gate had taken place only 5 days ago, and the Norwegians had completely routed the forces of the Northern Earls. The rest of the English army was known to be in the south, awaiting a Norman invasion. Turns out the English had ridden all the way up north in 4 days. The Norwegians were, understandably, a bit unhappy. They form into a circle. They don't have their armor with them, it's at the ships. It's too hot to be hanging around in mail. They've got helmets and shields and weaponry. And that's it. The English send a rider to negotiate. He tells Tostig that his brother the king is willing to offer him his earldom back and part of the rule of England if he gives up now. Tostig asks what his buddy Harald Hardrada gets for his trouble. 6 feet of English ground. Or as much more as he needs. Being taller than other men. Tostig says they're done here. The rider rides away. Harald Hardrada asks who that dude was. Because if it had been him talking, he'd have just killed the bastard there. Tostig says, "Oh, that's my brother. That's Harald Godwinson, the king." Harald Godwinson rode up to an enemy army personally and told the King of Norway, known to be a great warrior and general, that all he'd get from this invasion was a grave. Battle commences. Norwegians lose. Tostig and Harald Hardrada both die. Huge bloody mess. English army is crippled. And then 3 days later the Normans land in the south. Harald is fucked. He still marches his army back, gathers as much force as he can, and engages 3 weeks later. He's killed at Hastings. Normans conquer England. Basically a very personal fuck you moment that snowballed quite intensely. Edit. Because a lot of people are asking, yes, this was the battle with the legendary berserker at the bridge. No. It probably didn't actually happen. The story appears hundreds of years later and is very inconsistent. Also, there might not have been an actual bridge there at the time. This requires some background. The Spartans were famously blunt. They were trained to get to the point when speaking, instead of using artsy and beautiful language that would have been common at the time, by being bitten on the thumb if they became long-winded. Now to the meat. Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, sent the Spartans a letter saying, "Would you like me to enter your land as friend or foe?" The Spartans responded with one word: neither. Philip was irate. He then sent another long-winded message. "If once I enter into your territories, I will destroy ye all, never to rise again." The Spartans then sent back one word: if. It was like putting your head in a lion's mouth, and I love it. Edit. I was typing in a car. Excuse the typos. Operation Paul Bunyan. Here's the TLDR if you don't want to read the Wikipedia article. It's 1976. Some Americans at the Korean DMZ are cutting down a tree that obscures their vision to the North Korean side. A couple of North Koreans come out and kill a few Americans with their own axe. The Americans and South Koreans come back with such a massive show of force it's not even funny. Bombers. Jet planes. 27 helicopters. A full aircraft carrier moved off the coast. Thousands of troops. Troop carriers. Commandos. All just to send in a squad of army engineers with chainsaws to cut down that goddamn tree. I would highly recommend giving the forces used part of the Wikipedia article a read. It's riveting and hilarious. Edit. Thanks for the silver. Fellow appreciator of American awesomeness. Who knew my top comment would be about the most expensive tree cutting of all time? Genghis Khan to Shah Ala ad-Din. After the Khwarezmids plundered one of Genghis Khan's caravans, killed his people, and took his shit, he thought to take the diplomatic approach and send 2 envoys and an interpreter. Shah Ala ad-Din decided to be a dumbass about it. He shaved the heads of the envoys to shame them and sent them back with the head of the interpreter. Mr. Khan was kinda pissed. So he marched 200,000 of his boys and fucking annihilated their town with only 1/4 of that number even able to fight back. He was so pissed at the Shah that he had the rivers keeping the surrounding villages alive fully diverted. so that he would literally wipe Ala ad-Din's birthplace off the map and make it so that it was like he never existed. No one would settle there or live there ever again. No one would be there to remember his enemy who had disrespected him. Not even the dogs or cats would be spared, said Genghis Khan. On the crowning of King Henry VII, he backdated his own reign to before the date of the Battle of Bosworth, meaning anyone who was loyal to him now but had shown any sign of opposition at Bosworth was now a traitor and an enemy to the realm. Justice served. French surrender in WW2. Hitler dictates that the French capitulation take place at Compiègne, a forest north of Paris. This is the same spot where 22 years earlier the Germans had signed the armistice ending World War I. Hitler intends to disgrace the French and avenge the German defeat. To further deepen the humiliation, he orders that the signing ceremony take place in the same railroad car that hosted the earlier surrender. The armistice is signed on June 22. Under its terms, 2/3 of France is to be occupied by the Germans. The French army is to be disbanded. In addition, France must bear the cost of the German invasion. Khosrow Anushirwan was a Shah of Iran in the 500 CE. He took over a town, Antioch, that used to belong to the Byzantine Empire, ran by Emperor Justinian. But before he burned it to the ground, he had architects and a bunch of other people go through and record exactly what the city and its buildings looked like. He then built a new town that looked exactly the same and named it Way Antioch Khosrow, which translates roughly to Khosrow's better version of Antioch. And that's not even all of the ways Khosrow trolled Justinian. I recommend watching extra credit series on this dude. It's nuts. The Siege of Tyre. Basically, Alexander the Great was unable to capture the city because it was on an island. So he made it into a peninsula to be able to properly attack. And it is said that Alexander was so enraged at the Tyrians' defense of their city and the loss of his men that he destroyed half the city. That was a pretty big fuck you to Tyre, and I love this comic representation of the events by Flork of Cows. Julius Caesar's death. At least he died surrounded by friends. I would say the moment that Rollo swore allegiance to the French king. The bishops present suggested that Rollo kiss the king's foot as a sign of submission. It was probably an idea intended to humiliate Rollo, and was not taken very well. After some discussion, it was agreed that one of Rollo's men would do it. However, the person chosen lifted the king's foot, and, without bending down, brought it up to his mouth. Not surprisingly, the king fell over, amid general laughter in the court. Following this amusing scene, the king and his men swore to honor the concession to Rollo. Not the biggest, but definitely one to note. In 1966, Charles de Gaulle ordered all U.S. troops out of France, as he said the country was leaving NATO. LBJ's first words were to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. Ask him about the cemeteries. When Dean Rusk mentioned whether or not the 60,000 plus U.S. soldiers buried in France were to be removed, de Gaulle simply stood up and left the room. Embarrassed. Not the biggest, probably, but the first that came to mind. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's response to the Nazi demand that Bastogne surrender. Nuts. The reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks is the best response to a demand for surrender ever. In response to requests by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to desist attacks and submit. Zaporozhian Cossacks to the Turkish Sultan. O Sultan! Turkish devil and damned devil's kith and kin. Secretary to Lucifer himself. What the devil kind of knight are thou, that canst not slay a hedgehog with your naked ass? The devil shits, and your army eats. Thou shalt not, thou son of a whore, make subjects of Christian sons. We have no fear of your army. By land and by sea we will battle with thee. Fuck thy mother, thou Babylonian scullion, Macedonian wheelwright, brewer of Jerusalem, goat fucker of Alexandria, swineherd of Greater and Lesser Egypt, pig of Armenia, Podolian thief, catamite of Tartary, hangman of Kamayanes, and fool of all the world and underworld, an idiot before God, grandson of the serpent, and the crick in our dick, pig's snout, mare's ass, slaughterhouse cur, unchristened brow, screw thine own mother. So the Zaporozhians declare, you lowlife, you won't even be herding pigs for the Christians. Now we'll conclude, for we don't know the date and don't own a calendar. The moon's in the sky. The year with the Lord. The day's the same over here as it is over there, for this kiss our ass. Koshovi Otaman Ivan Serko. With the whole Zaporozhian host. Edit. 7 years in and my first gold. Neat. When Germanic tribes invaded Britain after the Romans left, they named the native Celts Wellisk, meaning foreigner, even though they themselves were the foreigners. That later became the word Welsh, which the English promptly adopted for phrases like Welch on a bet. TLDR. All of history has been one giant etymological middle finger to the Welsh. British prisoner of war in Nazi Germany stitches a quilt. The Nazis put it out for show. Hidden in Morse code stitched in were the words, "Fuck Hitler," and, "God save the Queen." Edit, "God save the King." I think I just had the Queen song stuck in my head. When Otto von Bismarck was about 50. He was walking down a street when a man ran up to him and shot him 5 times. Otto then turned around and began to beat the absolute shit out of him until some armed guards come to help him. When they inspected Otto for wounds, they found that all 5 hit. But they all either just grazed him or bounced off his ribs. Literally the Iron Chancellor. When Alcibiades fucked the Spartan king's wife, then fled to Persia, became a high command and made it back to Athens where he once started as a politicane and became one again. He said fuck you to Athens, he betrayed them, Sparta and Persia, and got away with it because he looked so damn good. In AD 37 the new Roman Emperor Gaius, better known by the nickname Caligula, built a bridge across the sea. It stretched 3 miles across the deep blue waters of the Bay of Naples at ancient Rome's most fashionable seaside resort of Baiae. But Caligula's was no ordinary bridge. It was a temporary, floating structure built on wooden pontoons. A costly and impressive feat of engineering. It served a single purpose before being dismantled. On a day of boiling heat watched by crowds of spectators, Caligula rode across the bridge. His armor glinted in the sunlight. For the 24-year-old emperor had dressed himself in the golden breastplate of the legendary Greek hero Alexander the Great. On the following day Caligula made the journey in reverse, this time riding in a chariot, followed by soldiers of his personal guard. It was a pointless piece of showmanship, lost on the majority of the crowd, several of whom fell drunkenly to their deaths in the sea after 2 days partying. One historian claimed Caligula pulled the stunt to disprove a prophecy that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. Henry VIII divorcing Catherine of Aragon. This is like the opposite of what you're asking for because it could have been a big fuck you, but it went another way. Abraham Lincoln, while still a largely unknown frontier lawyer, was asked to assist in a law case by some big wigs out in the East because the trial was going to be held in Springfield and they wanted a local lawyer on the team. Well, the location of the trial got moved, but the big wig lawyers never told Lincoln they didn't need him anymore. He worked really hard on some arguments and showed up to the trial, which was now in Ohio or something. The big wig lawyers were pretty rude to him when he showed up and didn't use any of his arguments and didn't allow him to participate. They did eventually send him a check for payment, but Abe sent it back. They did send it back writing enough to get Abe to deposit the check. When Abe became president, he eventually asked the head lawyer of the big wigs in this case, Edwin Stanton, to be his Secretary of War. Edwin Stanton grew to truly love Abraham Lincoln and was a very effective Secretary of War. Abe could have remembered the snub from earlier in his career and refused to have anything to do with Stanton, but Abe was never truly offended and saw Stanton as a good person to have in his cabinet. During the conquest of Constantinople, now Istanbul, when Sultan Mehmet had his ships carried on oily stakes by thousands of men to get past the big chain that prevents ships to enter Bosphorus. Several of them. My favorite is when Deng Xiaoping ordered the CAICOM army to invade Vietnam in order to teach them a lesson about the South China Sea dispute. The Chinese rolled across the border and were like, "Hey, where is everyone?" Looks like they didn't even field an army when they started getting hit with guerrilla types of attacks. The Chinese commies were supposed to mop the floor. They ended up incurring way more casualties than they anticipated and basically retreated back to China after 1 month and declared victory. Couldn't get a solid body blow on the Vietnamese army. Soviets invading Poland in 1939. On 30 Carat, September 1938. A treaty called Munich Agreement was signed, causing Germany's annexation of Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia, where many German people lived. It was signed by leaders of UK, France, Italy and Germany. UK and France signed it because Hitler promised that he won't go to war if he got the Sudetenland. We all know how that turned out. But that's not all. The biggest fuck you to Czechoslovakia was that they weren't invited to the meeting. Yes, they weren't invited to the meeting about their own region. Also, France was an ally of Czechoslovakia at the time. So yeah, thanks for support, France. Sorry for any mistakes. English is not my first language. Also, my first Reddit post. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like. If you would like to see more content like this in the future, subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified about future videos. Now check out one of these interesting videos.